All right, page 3 today for World Civ, chapter 25 on World War I. These are some posters that are trying to encourage people to enlist in the war. We'll talk about this one. This is pretty sad here. Anyway, so this is approaching the time that the United States is going to get involved in the war. This is about 1915. We had talked about unrestricted submarine warfare, which had continued. The Germans had sunk a British passenger ship called the Lusitania, with over 1,200 people being killed in that sinking of that ship, and over 100 of them were Americans. So there were some things that led to the U.S. involvement in the war. So just some kind of a progression here. So number one, neutrality was hard to maintain. There was a thing called the Zimmermann telegram or the Zimmermann note, and it was sent from Germany to Mexico. And if Mexico would ally themselves with Germany, then Mexico could recover some of the land that was taken from them, supposedly by the United States, namely Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and probably part of California. Anyway, that note was intercepted, and then the third thing, President Woodrow Wilson, he urged entry into the war, and Congress had approved that on April 6th of 1917. And President Wilson's comment, he spoke before Congress, and one of the things that he said was that we need to make the world safe for democracy. That's a famous statement. So, U.S. entry into the war, sinking of the Lusitania, 100 Americans were killed. More Americans were involved in the sinking of the Sussex. So 1915 is when the Lusitania was sunk, and then they continued that unrestricted submarine warfare. Another ship, the sinking of the Sussex. British propaganda, unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram. Anyway, these all raised public opinion. So propaganda, we have propaganda going on today. You look on the internet at memes, different things like that, and you look at a picture and you think, wow, how can that be true? Or I wouldn't support that, but you don't know if it's true or not. So propaganda is telling you things that lead you to a conclusion, or to have an opinion, or to change your opinion. So here's some articles about the sinking of the Lusitania. There's a whole movie that I used to show about the sinking of that ship. I'll just mention something real quick. The same team that went down and found the Titanic found the Lusitania. And the guy makes this comment. He said, well, the Titanic was opened up for 300 feet and took hours to sink, 3 or 4 hours. The Lusitania was hit with one torpedo and sunk in 15 to 20 minutes. And so he wanted to know why. And his conclusion, he felt comfortable with, was these ships are powered by coal. And as they were traveling across the Atlantic, when they got to the other side, those coal bunkers are pretty much empty except for a layer of coal dust. And when that torpedo had hit, it shook the bunker, and that coal dust got into the air and then ignited. And when it ignited that coal dust, it made a huge explosion. People remember hearing, the survivors said, they heard 2 explosions. So the torpedo hitting, and then those coal bunkers being ignited and exploding, and that opened it up and sunk the ship very quickly. Okay? So Russia was to the point, they were going through a revolution themselves in 1917. It's called the Bolshevik Revolution. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin eventually led the country, and he approached the Germans and asked them, they no longer wanted to fight, so they reached an agreement with them. So this was called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, offered to make peace with Germany. They signed a treaty in which Russia lost 1/3 of its people, 9/10 of its coal mines, and the Caucasian oil fields, all to Germany. So this ended their fighting. So with this Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was no longer a threat to Germany. They could then move most of their troops to the Western Front and hopefully win the war. So this increased German power. Okay. So this is the line, limit of occupation under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, March of 1918. And this is a line at the time of an armistice. And then that was the area in question that Russia would give up. So, okay. Ferdinand Foix was a general in the French army, and he commanded French and American troops at Chateau Thierry against the German offensive and was able to stop them. They had many campaigns, and so he's the French commander. Then John J. Pershing, I think he has a nickname, John J. Blackjack Pershing. I'm not sure why he's called that. He was the commander of the AEF, which is the American Expeditionary Force. Thousands of American troops had arrived in France. They carried out many successful campaigns and offensives. By the fall of 1918, Allied morale soared and German strength was spent. They were running out of supplies. They mounted one final counteroffensive. I believe it was the Second Battle of the Marne River there in France. So one by one, German allies quit. Turkey surrendered. The Ottoman Empire surrendered. German soldiers started to mutiny. Revolution broke out. The Kaiser fled to Holland. And so this ended Hohenzollern government and the end of the Second German Reich. So the armistice. An armistice is an agreement to end fighting. Now, fighting was taking place even though the armistice was reached. So if you remember in the video, it was October, I believe, at the end of the video. Well, the armistice was signed on the 11th hour. Well, it was signed, but the fighting would end on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So they agreed that's when the fighting would stop. So I believe in the video it was October, and there were still some little skirmishes, basically just putting in their time, waiting for the end. It was signed by 2 German delegates and Allied officials in northern France. I believe it was signed in a railroad car, the Compiègne forest, and so there was a lot of anger and resentment by the Germans. And so when World War II started, there was an agreement signed, and Hitler made the Allied forces sign an agreement in that very same railroad car. Allies made many demands, and then after the signing, the fighting ceased. Okay, so the war cost, and then we have one final page that discusses some of the main leaders and their positions and some of the final things that happened. But so 10 million men killed, 20 million wounded, 13 million civilians died. The total war cost $350 billion. And at this time there was a push for a League of Nations, and so that had started to gain momentum. Today it's called the United Nations, where it's supposed to look out around the world at different events and activities and hopefully keep peace throughout the world. But obviously, that really didn't happen. Many civilians died of famine, disease, and injuries from war. The League of Nations was to discuss the differences that would help them to avoid war. And I believe President Wilson also had kind of made some outlines called the 14 points. So we'll talk about that on the next page. And that's the end of page 3. So thank you.